The jungle holds its breath as thunder rolls across the canopy. On a misty morning in 1524, two armies face each other, the tension in the air heavy enough to taste. Spanish conquistadors in shiny armor lift their muskets, standing in firm and orderly rows. Opposite them stand Mayan warriors, their faces streaked with sacred paint, their obsidian-edged weapons catching the first rays of sunlight. They are outnumbered, but not outmatched in spirit. Between these forces, a lone figure steps forward. She wears a jade crown and the regalia of a queen, her presence commanding the attention of both sides. Ixkanul, the sacred fire, stands as the living embodiment of her people's defiance. Before her, the Spanish commander, Diego de Córdoba, extends his hand, a peace offering wrapped in thinly veiled threats. Behind her, thousands of warriors wait, their faith resting on her shoulders. The decision she makes here will decide the future of her people. For a moment, time seems to freeze. The drums of war are silent, and the jungle itself holds its breath. Ixkanul's thoughts race, taking her back to where it all began, the day the strange ships appeared on the horizon, their white sails piercing the morning mist like the wings of celestial birds. That day marked the collision of two worlds, the start of a story that would bring enemies together in ways neither could have foreseen, a story of love, betrayal, and survival against impossible odds. But this is not just the story of a queen and a conquistador. It is a tale of two civilizations locked in a struggle for survival, of traditions tested and faith questioned. It is the story of Ixkanul, a queen who dared to defy an empire, and Diego, a man who would come to question everything he believed. Together, they would stand at the edge of history, their choices echoing for generations. And so, as the armies wait, as destiny trembles in the balance, Ixkanul's voice cuts through the stillness. "You come to take what you do not understand," she says, "but you will not break what you cannot see." Under the vast canopy of stars, the Mayan world thrived as a civilization of knowledge, beauty, and spiritual depth. It was here in the heart of the jungle that Ixkanul was born in the year 1500. Her arrival was marked by signs that could not be ignored. A comet streaking across the sky, a quetzal bird landing on the palace's sacred window. The priest whispered of divine favor, and her name, Ixkanul, sacred fire, seemed to carry the weight of prophecy. As a child, Ixkanul was no ordinary princess. While others her age played among the temple courtyards, she wandered the libraries of the priests, her small fingers tracing the glyphs etched into stone. She devoured knowledge with an intensity that surprised her teachers, mastering the movements of stars, the cycles of the sacred calendar, and the intricate prophecies handed down for generations. The priests murmured among themselves, saying she had eyes of the ancients, as if the wisdom of her ancestors coursed through her veins. Her life changed irreversibly when a deadly fever swept through the royal palace, claiming her father and elder brothers. At just 12 years old, Ixkanul stood at the edge of chaos as rival factions vied for power. In this moment of vulnerability, it was her grandmother, a formidable priestess, who became her guide. "Power," her grandmother told her one evening as they walked beneath the sacred ceiba trees, "is like fire. It can destroy or illuminate. The choice is yours." Under her grandmother's mentorship, Ixkanul learned the art of leadership. She absorbed the wisdom of her people, while sharpening her ability to navigate the dangerous undercurrents of court politics. Her path to power was forged not with brute strength, but with her sharp mind and unwavering resolve. At 16, a devastating drought gripped her kingdom. The crops withered under the relentless sun, and hunger stalked the people. While the priests offered prayers and sacrifices, Ixkanul took a different approach. She studied ancient irrigation methods hidden in temple scrolls, and worked alongside farmers to bring water to the fields. Her efforts bore fruit, literally, and the people began to whisper that she was truly chosen by the gods. This success, however, earned her enemies among the nobility, who saw her growing influence as a threat. When the rivals made their move, Ixkanul was ready. In the great throne room, its air thick with incense and lit by the flickering glow of sacred fires, they confronted her. They came with accusations, weapons, and warriors at their side, but Ixkanul countered with evidence of their treachery. Messages intercepted by her spies, revealing their collusion with enemy city-states. She had also gained the quiet loyalty of the merchant council and the priesthood, two pillars of power within the kingdom. By dawn, her enemies had been silenced, not through bloodshed, but through her unshakable strategy. With her ascension to the throne, the kingdom entered a golden age. Trade routes flourished, temples reached ever higher, and the arts thrived under her patronage. Ixkanul ruled not as a figurehead, but as a leader who commanded both respect and loyalty. Her people called her "she who listens," a queen who took the concerns of the humblest farmer as seriously as those of the wealthiest merchant. Yet the gods had not marked her for a time of peace. One evening, as Ixkanul stood atop the pyramid temple watching the sunset cast its golden glow across the jungle, a messenger arrived. His face was pale, his breath ragged. "Ships," he gasped, pointing toward the distant coast. "Monstrous ships with wings like birds and hulls of gleaming wood." The news spread like wildfire. Fishermen spoke of strange men with pale faces and weapons that roared like thunder. Scouts reported smoke rising from burned villages. The omens the priests had spoken of, the falling stars, the restless gods, were now manifesting before their eyes. Ixkanul listened, absorbing every detail. She called her council together. The jade mosaic of her kingdom spread out before her. She knew that the arrival of these strangers would test not just her reign, but the very soul of her civilization. "We will not fear them," she said at last, her voice steady. "But we will learn their strength, and we will protect what is ours." As the stars rose that night, Ixkanul climbed the steps of the great observatory, her eyes fixed on Venus, the morning star. She had no way of knowing what lay ahead, the alliances that would form, the betrayals that would come, and the choices that would change the course of history. But she knew this: the fire within her, the sacred fire of her name, would not be extinguished. The sea mist parted like a veil, revealing ships unlike anything the Mayans had ever seen. Their towering white sails rose high above the waves, casting long shadows on the water. Wooden crosses adorned their bows, gleaming in the sunlight as if blessed by some foreign god. On the shores of the coastal village, fishermen abandoned their nets, their faces pale as they watched the monsters approach. By nightfall, the news had reached Ixkanul's court. Messengers, their legs covered in dust from the sacred roads, described the strangers as men clad in shining metal, carrying weapons that roared like thunder and spat fire. "They ride beasts that devour the earth," one scout reported, his voice trembling. "No arrow can pierce them. They are not men, they are spirits or gods." The council chamber erupted in alarm, but Ixkanul's voice cut through the panic. "Enough," she said, her gaze steady. "These gods bleed like men. We will know their strength and their weakness before we act." The leader of these strangers, Diego de Córdoba, was not like the soldiers who followed him. When he arrived at Ixkanul city, he did so with a deliberate air of diplomacy. The procession was a calculated display of Spanish power. Soldiers in polished armor, mounted cavalry striking awe and fear into onlookers, and banners bearing the crest of the Spanish crown snapping in the wind. Yet Diego himself carried an air of quiet observation. He did not bark orders or boast of his mission. Instead, he studied everything: the people, the temples, even the jungle. Ixkanul met his arrival with equal precision. She summoned her council, her warriors, and her priests to line the 1,000 steps of her pyramid palace. As Diego and his men climbed, they passed between ranks of jaguar warriors with obsidian-edged weapons and priests tending sacred fires. Ixkanul had instructed artisans to display their finest works in open workshops, showcasing the wealth and sophistication of her kingdom. By the time Diego entered the throne room, he had seen enough to know that this was no land of savages. The first meeting between the queen and the conquistador was a silent battle of wits. Diego presented gifts of steel mirrors, silk cloth, and a letter from his king, demanding submission. Ixkanul accepted the offerings with grace, but countered with her own subtle display of power. She gestured to the room's grandeur, the gold-encrusted carvings, the jade mosaics, the incense rising in intricate curls. "Your king sends fine treasures," she said, her voice calm. "Strange that they are accompanied by so many weapons." Diego allowed himself a faint smile. "Your Majesty," he replied, his tone measured. "Beauty and danger often walk hand in hand. For weeks the Spaniards camped near the city, an uneasy coexistence taking root. Ixkanul used the time to learn everything she could about these strangers. Her spies reported on their weapons, their tactics, and their weaknesses. She discovered that their armor, while impenetrable to arrows, was unbearably hot under the jungle sun. Their horses, though terrifying, struggled on the steep mountain paths, and their reliance on supply lines made them vulnerable in a land as vast and untamed as the jungle. Diego, too, observed. He marveled at the Mayan people's knowledge of astronomy and medicine, their intricate rituals and architecture. Yet he struggled to reconcile this sophistication with the orders he carried: to conquer, to subjugate, to destroy if necessary. The fragile balance shifted during a sacred ball game, held in honor of the visitors. In the Great Stone Court, Mayan athletes demonstrated both their skill and their reverence for the gods, moving with precision to keep the rubber ball airborne using only their hips and knees. The Spanish soldiers watched with a mix of awe and confusion, failing to understand the game's deeper meaning. But the tension erupted when one of Diego's men, emboldened by honey wine, stumbled into the court. The breach of sacred space demanded a blood sacrifice according to Mayan law. As jaguar warriors seized the offender, the Spanish soldiers reached for their weapons, ready to escalate the situation into war. Ixkanul and Diego acted simultaneously. She raised her hand, commanding her warriors to hold. He stepped forward, silencing his soldiers with a sharp command. Their eyes met across the court, and for a brief moment, both leaders saw the same question reflected in the other's gaze. Could they find a way to bridge this chasm between their worlds? The crisis was diffused, but the delicate peace that followed was haunted by the knowledge that it could not last. Ixkanul's spies brought news of more Spanish forces moving inland, burning villages as they advanced. Diego received letters from his superiors, urging him to hasten the conquest. Both leaders knew the storm was coming. One evening, beneath the light of a full moon, Diego and Ixkanul spoke alone in the temple gardens. Their conversation, a mixture of gestures and broken words in each other's languages, revealed their shared fears and conflicting duties. Diego spoke of the pressure to obey his king, while Ixkanul described the burden of preserving her people's way of life. "We are chained by our roles," Diego said softly, his voice tinged with regret. "But chains can be broken," Ixkanul replied, her tone resolute. For all their differences, they found a fragile understanding. Yet the question lingered. When the inevitable clash came, would they stand as allies or enemies? The jungle glowed silver in the moonlight, its vast expanse filled with the soft hum of life. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming orchids and the earthy tang of rain-soaked leaves. It was here, amidst the sacred ceiba trees, that Ixkanul and Diego found themselves meeting in secret. Their conversations began as guarded exchanges, born of necessity and strategy, but they soon grew into something more, a tenuous bond forged in the crucible of shared burdens. For Diego, every encounter chipped away at the certainty of his mission. The Mayan queen was unlike any ruler he had encountered, a woman of wisdom and fire, commanding loyalty not through fear but through an unshakable connection to her people. In her, he saw the strength of a civilization he had been taught to view as inferior. For Ixkanul, Diego represented a paradox, an invader who carried not just weapons but curiosity and doubt. He was both a threat and a reflection of the humanity she refused to lose sight of, even in war. Their meetings were dangerous. Ixkanul's advisors grew suspicious of her frequent absences, their whispers tinged with both concern and reproach. To them, Diego was an outsider, a harbinger of destruction who could never be trusted. Among the Spaniards, similar doubts festered. Diego's men noticed his reluctance to press the conquest, his absences from the camp, and his uncharacteristic silence during discussions of strategy. One night under the shelter of the jungle canopy, Diego confessed his inner turmoil. "Do you know what they call me?" he asked, his voice low, almost bitter. "The King's Blade, a weapon to cut through those who stand in his way. I was raised to believe in my purpose, to bring glory to Spain and salvation to its enemies. But here, with you, I see something else." Ixkanul met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "And what is it you see?" she asked. He hesitated, struggling to find the words. "I see a people who do not need saving, a queen who leads with more grace and wisdom than my king could dream of. And I see the cost of what we've done, what we will do." Her voice softened, but her resolve remained. "If you see this, then why do you stay with them? Why carry out their will?" Diego looked away, the weight of her question pressing on him. "Because I don't know how to leave. To defy them would mean losing everything, my position, my honor, my life." Ixkanul's response was swift and pointed. "Honor that serves destruction is no honor at all." Despite the tension between their worlds, a fragile trust began to form. Ixkanul shared her people's wisdom with Diego, explaining their connection to the land, the gods, and the intricate balance that sustained their way of life. Diego, in turn, revealed the weaknesses of the Spanish forces, their dependence on supply lines, their susceptibility to the jungle's relentless heat and humidity, and the deep cracks in their morale. Yet, their bond was more than just an exchange of knowledge. There were moments when the war seemed to fade, and they spoke as two leaders carrying the weight of impossible choices. Diego shared stories of his childhood in Spain, of the nights spent gazing at the stars and dreaming of a life beyond the rigid expectations of his station. Ixkanul listened, her curiosity tempered by caution, and in return, she spoke of her people's sacred connection to the cosmos, the prophecies that guided their lives, and the vision that had carried her through every trial. But even as their understanding deepened, the world around them grew darker. The Spaniards, frustrated by the stalemate, began launching raids on villages, torching homes and enslaving survivors. In retaliation, Ixkanul's warriors struck at the Spanish supply lines, cutting off their food and forcing them to retreat into smaller, more vulnerable groups. Each victory came at a cost, as the jungle itself seemed to bleed under the weight of the conflict. One fateful night, as Diego returned to his camp, he found chaos. His men, restless and hungry, had raided a sacred Mayan temple, tearing gold from its walls and smashing altars in search of treasure. The desecration enraged Ixkanul's people, and retaliation was swift, a series of deadly ambushes that left Spanish soldiers scattered and desperate. When Diego arrived at Ixkanul's city, he came not as a commander but as a man seeking forgiveness. He stood before the queen, his head bowed, his armor smeared with the blood of his own men. "I did not order this," he said, his voice breaking, "but it is my burden to bear." Ixkanul's gaze was cold, her voice steady. "You did not stop it. And now my people are dead, their sacred places defiled. Tell me, Diego, how does your honor carry such weight?" For the first time, Diego had no answer. He knelt before her, the lines of his face etched with shame. "Let me fix this," he pleaded. "Let me show them that this war can end another way." Ixkanul studied him for a long moment, her mind racing through the possibilities. Finally, she extended her hand, her voice sharp and unwavering. "If you betray me," she said, "there will be no forgiveness. No second chances." Diego grasped her hand, his grip firm. "I will not betray you," he said. "Not again." Their bond, fragile as it was, became the foundation for a dangerous alliance. Together they planned to bridge the chasm between their worlds, to find a way to end the bloodshed without sacrificing the soul of Ixkanul's people. But both knew that the path ahead was treacherous, and that trust, once broken, could never be mended. The jungle roared with the sound of war. Spanish cannons thundered, their blasts shaking the earth and sending plumes of smoke rising above the treetops. Ixkanul's warriors moved like shadows, striking from the cover of dense foliage and disappearing before the Spaniards could regroup. The jungle, once a place of harmony, had become a battlefield, its sacred silence broken by the cries of the wounded and the clash of obsidian and steel. Ixkanul stood at the center of it all, commanding her forces with a calm resolve that belied the chaos around her. From atop the pyramid temple, she watched as her people fought to protect their land, their gods, and their way of life. Her voice carried over the din, rallying her warriors with words that burned like fire. "This jungle is ours," she declared. "Every tree, every stone, every breath of air is sacred. Let them see that their cannons cannot break what we hold in our hearts." Despite their valor, the cost of resistance was immense. The Spanish forces were relentless, their superior weaponry carving a devastating path through the Mayan defenses. Entire villages were razed, their inhabitants forced to flee deeper into the jungle. Yet, even as the Spaniards advanced, they found themselves ensnared by Ixkanul's strategies. She used the terrain to her advantage, turning the jungle itself into a weapon. Rivers were dammed to flood their camps, paths were trapped with hidden spikes, and supply lines were severed, leaving the invaders hungry and vulnerable. Diego de Córdoba had become an enigma among his own men. Though still a Spanish commander in name, his actions often seemed to serve Ixkanul's cause. He advised her on Spanish tactics, revealing weaknesses she could exploit, and he brokered temporary ceasefires that gave her people time to regroup. His loyalty to the Spanish crown had been replaced by something more complicated, a desire to protect the queen who had shown him a world beyond conquest. But Diego's divided loyalties came at a cost. Among Ixkanul's ranks, whispers of distrust grew louder. Some questioned whether he could truly be trusted, whether his presence was a sign of betrayal waiting to happen. Among the Spaniards, Diego was seen as a man who had lost his way, his reluctance to press the assault earning him the ire of his superiors. The tipping point came during a critical battle for a trade city deep within the jungle. The city was a vital hub for Ixkanul's kingdom, its loss threatening to sever her people's connection to their allies. The Spaniards, aware of its importance, launched an all-out assault, their cannons roaring as their soldiers advanced under the cover of fire. Ixkanul's warriors met them with unyielding ferocity, their war cries echoing through the dense jungle. Diego fought alongside the Mayans, his blade flashing as he defended the city's gates. His presence on the battlefield was a shock to the Spaniards, who shouted accusations of treason as they clashed with their former commander. For Ixkanul, his actions spoke louder than words. Whatever doubts she had harbored about his loyalty, they were silenced by the sight of him standing shoulder to shoulder with her people, his armor streaked with blood and dirt. The battle raged for hours, the tide shifting with every blow. Ixkanul's warriors, though outnumbered, fought with a desperation born of love for their homeland. The Spaniards, weighed down by their armor and the unfamiliar terrain, struggled to maintain their advantage. As night fell, the city remained in Mayan hands, but the victory was bittersweet. The ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen, and the air was heavy with the smell of smoke and death. In the aftermath, Ixkanul and Diego stood on the city's walls, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames of torches. "This is not a victory," Diego said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "They will come back, and they will come stronger." "I know," Ixkanul replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But every day we hold them back is a day we teach them that we will not be broken." As the wounded were tended and the dead were honored, Ixkanul began to see the cracks forming within her own ranks. The relentless war had taken its toll, and the unity that had once defined her people was beginning to fray. Some questioned the cost of resistance, while others clung to their faith that Ixkanul would lead them to salvation. Among her closest advisors, the debate grew heated. Should they fight to the last breath, or seek a way to coexist with the invaders? For Ixkanul, the answer was clear. "We fight," she told her council. "Not because we believe we can win, but because to give up is to lose everything we are. Our gods, our land, our spirit, they are worth every sacrifice." Diego, standing at her side, said nothing. He knew that her resolve would not waver, even as the odds stacked higher against them. Yet he could not ignore the reality of their situation. The Spanish forces were growing, their reinforcements pushing ever deeper into the jungle. If they were to survive, Ixkanul would need more than courage and strategy. She would need a way to change the rules of the game entirely. The jungle stood silent, its wounds hidden beneath a canopy of green. The towering pyramids, once alive with the vibrant ceremonies of Ixkanul's people, now bore the scars of war. Smoke no longer curled from the sacred fires, but the stories of what had happened here lingered in every stone, every shadow, every breath of the jungle. Ixkanul's name became legend, carried by the survivors who whispered her story around fires and etched her memory into the sacred glyphs. She was the queen who stood unyielding against an empire, the sacred fire that refused to be extinguished. Though the Spaniards claimed victory in the end, they could not conquer her spirit, nor the spirit of the people she had led. Diego de Cordoba's legacy was more complicated. Branded a traitor by his own men, he vanished from Spanish records. His fate left to the speculation of historians and storytellers. Among the Mayans, he was remembered as the divided one, a man who had walked the line between invader and ally, between duty and conscience. Some saw him as a hero who had risked everything to protect Ixkanul and her people. Others saw him as a symbol of the impossible choices forced upon those caught between worlds. Though their lives ended in tragedy, their story planted seeds of change that would outlast both empires. Among the Mayan survivors, a quiet revolution began. Under Ixkanul's guidance, her people had learned to adapt without losing themselves. Temples, once adorned only with jade and gold, now bore crosses as well. But beneath them, the old gods were still honored in whispered prayers. Children learned Spanish alongside their glyphs, their songs blending the rhythms of both cultures into something entirely new. Even among the Spaniards, the echoes of Ixkanul's resistance were felt. Diego's letters, written in the final days of his life, described the Mayans as a people of extraordinary wisdom and resilience. Though dismissed by many, his words found their way into the hands of younger commanders, priests, and settlers. They began to question the brutality of conquest, their beliefs softened by the knowledge of the people they had sought to dominate. Years passed, and the jungle began to reclaim the battlefield. Vines crept over the ruins of Spanish camps, and the scars of war faded into the land. But the memory of Ixkanul endured. Her people preserved her legacy in their stories, speaking of a queen who had stood between two worlds and dared to imagine a different future. In time, her legend grew. In villages scattered across the jungle, children were named after her, their parents hoping to pass on her strength. Scholars, both Mayan and Spanish, pieced together her story, ensuring that her defiance would not be forgotten. And in the hearts of those who still fought to protect their culture, Ixkanul remained a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit could endure. Her final words to her people, recorded in the glyphs of the last surviving temple, became a mantra for generations. We are not just of the jungle, we are of the stars. Our fire will not die, even when the winds of history try to extinguish it.